Tell me about the scary situations in your life when you suddenly realized it's time to get out right now.
A year ago, we had Hurricane Florence in our state.
We planned to go for a walk on the hill and in places where strong winds were not expected. For the most part, we didn't pay much attention to news warnings.
The night before the hurricane, I had an extremely uneasy feeling in my gut and started begging my dad to go to my sister's place, which was a couple of hours away from the coast.
We even had an argument about it, but in the end, I convinced him.
We returned a week after the hurricane and saw a fallen tree on our house, which was also flooded. A tornado had formed in the forest behind the house, which brought the tree down onto our roof. After this incident, I always trust my gut, no matter how silly it may seem. When I was little, some guy came up to me and started asking how to get somewhere.
I was trying to explain the way to him when I suddenly saw a van pulling up with its side door open. I bolted and didn't look back. I was at a party at some people's place when they suddenly told the guests to continue partying in the basement.
They were smiling, but their tone was aggressive.
Most of my friends and I left immediately, but one of our guys decided to stay. He ended up getting robbed. Several years ago, my boyfriend owned a tire repair company. One time, he went to a client's house without warning to ask them to write a check because they owed the company a large sum of money. When he came out of the house, he was a bit agitated.
He explained that the house was full of the client's brothers, which was unusual for him, and they all seemed very nervous.
They still wrote him a check and then quickly sent him off.
That day, my boyfriend had a strange feeling of unease.
2 days later, the client and his brothers were arrested for a murder they had committed the day before our visit. Once, a friend and I decided to go camping in the woods. There were few campsites in that area, and they were all very isolated from each other. We would have stayed there overnight had the place been fully prepared and equipped, but we ended up having to find everything we needed and set up camp. We drove to the nearest town for food, and on our way back to our little cozy campsite, we encountered a man on the road. We locked eyes with him and immediately felt uneasy. He looked at us with pure hatred, as if we were his enemies, but we had never seen him before. When we returned to the camp, we saw things scattered everywhere. Our bags were lying near the tent, clothes were strewn about.
We immediately noticed the loss of 2 hunting knives, plus some clothes were missing. We instantly thought that the man we encountered on the road did it, as that trail led nowhere but to our site. We drove a bit further and came across a communal area where other campers were hanging out. We got out and asked them, "Hey guys, has anyone seen a man?" and described him. The crowd just stared at us in silence, which made us feel even creepier, and I told my friend, "We need to leave, right now." As we were heading back to the car, we saw all our stolen clothes behind a fence. We quickly gathered everything, but there wasn't a single knife among the items. With the thought that the man was still out there, armed with our knives, and with no one around, we nervously jumped into the car and sped away. There was no way we were staying in that forest overnight. This is the common sense I appeal to people every time I watch horror movies about camping. I'm telling you, all these rituals are completely harmless. One night, around 2 a.m., we were sleeping in our top-floor apartment when suddenly we woke up to the fire alarm going off. It was late, we didn't want to get up, and we thought the alarm was false, but then I suddenly saw smoke seeping in from under the door. It was terrifying to imagine what was behind the door. We ran as fast as we could down the stairs, choking on the fumes and barely able to see where we were going. A horrible experience I'll never forget. I'll keep this story in mind and try to take fire alarms more seriously. Once while hiking, I saw a bear cub in the forest. I slowly turned around and quickly walked away from it because, I didn't want to get eaten. I had to drag my friend by the collar because he didn't understand why we were suddenly turning around and heading back the way we came. Actually, you wouldn't get eaten, but its mother would definitely kill you. The most dangerous thing you can encounter in the forest is a bear cub. My car was stolen the same night we moved into a new house in a very good neighborhood. The neighbors warned us that things had been unsettled in the area lately, with occasional robberies happening. They told us how a woman was recently robbed when she opened the door to someone knocking late at night. The intruders attacked her, robbed her, and almost killed her. So, after the theft, we immediately contacted the police. A couple of days later, in the middle of the night, I hear a knock on the door. Open up, it's the police. Keeping in mind the recent story about the poor woman's robbery, I got suspicious and didn't answer. I took the kids and led them to a room from which we could climb onto the roof through the window. Then I called the police and said that 2 men were knocking on our door, claiming to be the police. They told me there were no police officers in the area and that they would send a car immediately.
Turns out, it was the same guys who had stolen our car, and they had decided to come back. I got my car back. They had brought it with them.
How nice of them. I hope they filled up the tank.
While on vacation, I was walking in a nature reserve.
It was shaped like a crater with a path along the edge that you could walk down almost to the bottom.
I had a strong gut feeling that it was not a good idea to go down there.
Later that day, I learned about a woman who had been killed by a heavy object when kids were throwing rocks and branches from the slope.
I was babysitting when I suddenly heard someone scraping something metallic against the window. I immediately hid the children in the closet and called the police. A little longer and we would have been robbed or worse. With your lightning-fast reaction, you probably saved many lives. Great job. I was walking along a long road. No houses, just a cemetery. A van with two guys pulled up next to me, and they asked if I wanted a ride. This was in the late 90s when hitchhiking wasn't exactly legal or common. So I told them, "No, thanks, I'm almost home." They wouldn't take no for an answer. They drove alongside me with their windows down, trying to persuade me, "Come on, hop in, what's the harm?" At some point, they just stopped and started getting out of the van. I was only a teenager, and they were in their 20s. I realized I had to run. I think I sprinted for about a kilometer until I reached the nearest alley and hid behind the first building by the road. I waited for about 15 minutes, and only then, convinced they had given up and weren't following me, did I go home. I was walking with my sister in a local park. We arrived around 3 p.m. and wandered around until 9 to 9:30. We then saw three guys in matching clothes on the other side of the park. I noticed them right away but didn't think much of it. We walked for another couple of minutes, and I saw one of them stop and stare at us. I immediately got a creepy feeling and told my sister we needed to leave. She understood right away, and we got out of there. Later that night, there was an emergency news report about a stabbing in the park, and the suspects were those three guys we saw. About 20 years ago, as a teenager, I was biking home from a friend's place. We had lost track of time and stayed out late, so I was heading back when it was already dark. I lived about a couple of kilometers from my friend's house. I turned onto one of the roads that led home when I suddenly had a strange feeling. I looked back and saw headlights. A car stopped at the intersection and slowly turned onto the road I was on. This road had almost no houses, no streetlights, nothing. As soon as they turned, I bolted into the woods and hid far from the road. The car slowed down, drove past, and kept going. I have no idea what they wanted, but I had no desire to find out. I remember once driving down from the mountains with my grandmother and seeing a bear cub that ran out and stopped on the road. It just stared at us and waited. Grandma hit the brakes, and we stopped. After about 5 minutes, the cub finally moved on, but Grandma didn't move. I asked why we weren't leaving, and she pointed to the side window. That's why. I looked out and saw a big, old mother bear slowly following her cub. Man, it was terrifying, but at least we were in the car and could drive away quickly if needed. We were drinking at a bar with friends, in Sydney. Two guys walked by, and I accidentally made eye contact with one of them. He pulled out a gun, pointed it at me, and nodded towards the door. He didn't need to ask twice. During my freshman year in college, I went to a party with some sketchy people. The night was getting very tense, but there were no fights or anything like that. As the night went on, it became clear something was about to happen. I told my buddy we needed to leave. Not 5 minutes after we left, someone got stabbed, and the guy who did it was shot. What kind of college is that? I went on a second date with a guy. At some point, he wanted to stop by his place to pick something up and invited me in. He was very attractive, but for some reason, I felt uneasy around him. We entered his house, and inside it was downright creepy. The guy had money, and the house was luxurious. It was immaculate and completely sterile. Nothing on the walls, empty shelves, nothing. No books, no CDs, nothing. I asked how long he had lived there, and he said, 5 years. He went to the kitchen for something and yelled for me to go to his room and grab the keys from the top drawer of his dresser. A chill ran down my spine, and I immediately moved closer to the front door. I did not want him standing between me and the exit. He asked me again to go to his room, and I laughed and said, "No, man, I'm so hungry. Let's go." He asked again, now clearly irritated, and I started acting dumb, whining about being hungry and why was he taking so long. He got furious. I walked out of the house and down the sidewalk, and he had to follow me.
We reached the car, and I kept up my act, demanding he take me home. He drove me home in eerie silence. When he stopped the car in front of my house, he grabbed my face to kiss me goodbye. He bit my lips so hard I started bleeding. Then he shoved his hand under my shirt and grabbed my nipple.
Luckily, I pushed him away, fell out of the car, and ran home while he laughed maniacally. I ended up with bruises on my face and chest, a cut lip, and the terrifying thought that he knew where I lived.
Sounds like the movie, American Psycho.
Yeah,
that was one of the reasons I got so scared at his place. Thank you for watching. Have you had any scary stories happen to you? Tell us about it in the comments.
Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.